The Hungry Mirror. The year was 1678, and the air in Blackwood Village held a chill that was full of foreboding. Deep in the English countryside, the village lay under a mist that seemed perpetual, with cobblestone streets lined with houses that seemed older than time itself. Among these buildings was the infamous Blackwood Manor, an abandoned estate that no villager would dare approach. It was said, too, that there is a mirror cursed and lodged within the walls, an old relic belonging to a sorceress of great fear named Evelyn Darkmoor. Evelyn's name had been immortalized in the annals of Blackwood's history as an emblem of fear. She had been accused of conducting forbidden rituals and of summoning spirits from beyond. When she met her fiery end at the stake, her belongings were scattered, but one object, a large ornate mirror, vanished into thin air. The legends say that the mirror had a hunger, an appetite for souls. Centuries later, in the year 1771, the manor stood as a decaying reminder of the village's dark past. It was here that Eliza Brown, a young historian and researcher of supernatural folklore, found herself. Eliza had spent years chasing legends, but none intrigued her more than the tale of the Hungry Mirror. Armed with a lantern and her journal, she stepped into the manor, her heart pounding as the heavy wooden door creaked open. Inside, Blackwood Manor was like a time capsule of decay. Faded wallpaper clung to the walls, broken furniture lay on the floor. As Eliza moved inside, she marked that eerie silence. Even rats running through would not disturb the air. She moved inside, her lantern casting flickering shadows that seemed almost alive. Eliza found it behind a bookshelf in some small, hidden chamber. Its frame is gilded with carvings of serpents and roses, their details very lifelike, unnerving to behold. The glass was immaculate, untouched by the passing of time, as if she had just taken it from the shop counter. Still, when Eliza looked into it, she felt an inexplicable feeling of unease. The air grew chilly, and the outline of Eliza in the mirror seemed to wave like water on a window pane. A soundless whisper echoed in the room, but she could hardly catch what it was saying. Shocked, she almost let the lantern drop. The reflection returned to being glass-like again, but Eliza felt the urge to escape. She sat there still, scribbling furiously in her journal, knowing not that she had made something long slumbering stir. That night, Eliza stayed at an inn nearby. As she went through her notes, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The image of the mirror haunted her mind, the movement of her reflection, the whisper she couldn't understand. She decided to return to the manor the next day, determined to uncover the secrets of the mirror. However, she was tormented at night by nightmares. She dreamt of dark figures confined behind the mirror, their hollow eyes staring at her. One figure seemed to reach out to her, its skeletal hand pressing against the glass. Eliza woke with a start, drenched in sweat, her heart racing. It was still early morning when she discovered scratches on her arms. They were thin, jagged marks that had not been there before. Panic began to set in, but she rationalized it as the effect of her restless sleep. She could not let fear deter her. The next day, Eliza delved into the village archives, piecing together the fragmented history of Evelyn Darkmoor and her mirror. The villagers of the 17th century had believed the mirror to be a gateway, a portal through which Evelyn communed with other worldly entities. Witnesses had claimed to see figures moving within the glass, their mouths forming silent screams. One story had been that a young maid named Abigail, who had been working in the manor, disappeared completely. She was said to have been taken by the mirror along with her soul, as only a hollow shell remained in her family's eyes. This made Eliza's curiosity grow. Overcoming her fear, she now decided to return to that manor on that same night. Eliza was now standing again in front of the mirror, burning circles of candles around herself to use the old protection spell which she read through the ancient archivers, and sitting by opening her journal to make some observations. But this time, The mirror waited not. The air got thick, and candle flames danced with a life of their own. Shadows coiled within the glass, gathering into faces, distorted, anguished faces that peered at her with lifeless eyes. "Eliza," a rasping voice croaked. She spun round, and no one was there. The voice came again, louder, clearer. "Eliza, set us free." Eliza felt afraid but hypnotized, stretching out to touch the glass. The instant her fingers grazed it, a rush of cold power filled her. She was not in the room anymore. She was in an enormous empty space. Surrounding her were the trapped souls within the mirror, skeletal hands clawing at her, and their despair a cacophony of whispers. "Eliza, wake up!" she screamed at herself, trying to pull away. With one final effort, she yanked her hand back, collapsing onto the floor of the chamber. The mirror's surface rippled violently before going still. Eliza ran out of the manor, her mind racing with questions. Who were the souls in the mirror? How had they become trapped? And most importantly, how could she stop the mirror's hunger? The scratches on her arms had deepened, now forming strange, unrecognizable symbols. She knew she couldn't face this alone. With her journal in hand, she vowed to find someone who could help her uncover the truth behind the hungry mirror. But as she walked away from the manor, she failed to notice her reflection lingering in the mirror, watching her with a sinister grin. She could not shake the unease that clung to her like a shadow. Even in the humble room of the village inn, she could feel unseen eyes upon her. The pull of the mirror was undeniable. Its whispers etched themselves into her memory. Hours passed as she sat staring over her journal, attempting to decipher symbols that appeared mysteriously on her arms. They appeared ancient, more so than any script that she had encountered during research. Determined to uncover the truth, Eliza decided to seek help. The name Father Dominic, a reclusive priest and scholar rumored to have knowledge of occult artifacts, surfaced in her mind. He resided in the neighboring town of Hallowbridge, an hour's journey by foot. But as she prepared to leave, the scratches on her arm began to throb, as though the mirror itself resisted her decision to seek aid. The path to Hallowbridge was lonely and winding through dense woods. The trees loomed overhead, their skeletal branches clawing at the overcast sky. Eliza couldn't ignore the eerie stillness that enveloped the forest. No birds sang, no leaves rustled. It was as if nature itself had fallen silent, holding its breath in anticipation. As she walked, Eliza felt a sense of creeping unease, the presence of something behind her. She looked over her shoulder, but the path was empty. And yet the feeling remained, strengthened at every step. Halfway through the journey, she saw something peculiar, her shadow. It moved separately, as if alive, twitching unnaturally in the poor light. Panic set into her as the shadow started stretching and twisting, morphing into a grotesque shape that was no longer her own. She ran harder, her heart pounding. The shadow kept pace with her. At last, the silhouette of Hallowbridge's church tower appeared in the distance. Eliza burst into a sprint, desperate to shake whatever pursued her. She crossed the threshold of the town, and the oppressive weight that had pressed upon her, suffocating her, lifted, and her shadow returned to normal. Father Dominic was a gaunt, gray-haired man with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through her. His study was lined with shelves of ancient tomes and relics, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and candle wax. Eliza explained her discovery, showing him the sketches in her journal and recounting her experiences with the mirror. Dominic's face grew darker as he listened. "You have seen the Mirror of Darkmoor," he said somberly. "It is no ordinary artifact. It is a vessel of torment, a prison for lost souls. Evelyn Darkmoor's magic bound those who crossed her into that cursed glass, feeding on their essence to sustain its power." He examined the marks on her arms, furrowing his brow. "These marks are warnings," he said. "You have awakened the mirror's hunger, and it has marked you as its next prey. The more you interact with it, the stronger its pull will become. Eliza shivered. "Can it be destroyed?" she asked. Dominic shook his head. "Not by any power known to man. But there is a way to seal its power, an ancient ritual that requires great sacrifice. You must decide if you are willing to pay the price." Eliza passed the night in Hallowbridge, but her slumber was not asleep at all. The moment her lids closed over her eyes, she again stood before the glass. The room was filled with an otherworldly illumination, and the whispers now grew loud, urgent. "Eliza, come with us." The faces in the mirror had become clearer now, features twisted in anguish. A young woman with hollow eyes stood out, one face in particular. She wore a mournful expression on her face. Eliza realized with a jolt that this was Abigail, the maid whose disappearance she had read about in the village archives. "Help us!" Abigail's voice echoed. But before Eliza could respond, a hand shot out from the mirror, clawing at her throat. She woke with a scream, her heart racing. The scratches on her arms had deepened, and fresh symbols had appeared, glowing faintly in the darkness. The following day, Father Dominic led Eliza to see the ancient manuscript that explained all about the sealing ritual. It would take salt, iron, and sacred symbols, setting a boundary that would confine the power of the mirror. However, there was one thing required: a key, a human soul who was willing to take on the role as anchor for the seal. A shiver ran through Eliza. "You mean someone has to give themselves up?" Dominic nodded gravely. "The mirror's hunger cannot be stopped, only contained. The key becomes a guardian, forever bound to keep the mirror's power at bay." Eliza's mind ran. Could she ask someone to make such a sacrifice? Could she do it herself? The thought was unbearable, but the alternative, leaving the mirror unchecked, was far worse. Determined to find answers, Eliza returned to Blackwood Manor, armed with the manuscript and Father Dominic's instructions. She prepared the materials for the ritual, but as she approached the mirror, she hesitated. The air around it seemed alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy. "Eliza!" Abigail's voice called again, softer this time. "You must listen." The surface of the mirror rippled, and Eliza found herself in a vision of the past. She saw Evelyn Darkmoor doing the same ritual, her hands shaking as she chanted in an ancient tongue. And around her were the souls of those she had trapped, her victims, now fuel for the mirror. She tried to stop it, Abigail's voice said, but her greed was stronger. She wanted its power for herself. Now it seeks another to wield it. Eliza came to understand the truth of things. The mirror was no jailer. It was a tool, corrupting any soul who sought to use it for his own purposes. As Eliza's connection to the mirror deepened, its influence began to seep into her life. Objects in her room moved on their own, shadows flickered where no light should have been, and the whispers followed her wherever she went. One night, staring in the mirror, she had some bizarre urge to reach for the glass again. Her reflected face grinned at her, evil and knowing, making chill runs down her spine. "Eliza," it said, "you can't go any further. Nobody else ever could." She shattered the lantern she gripped in her hand with a scream, plunging her into darkness. And though darkness covered everything, Eliza could feel that there, behind the glass, was watching. With every day, the burden of the curse inside that mirror grew heavier, heavier. Eliza went back to Blackwood Manor, wanting to confront the thing invading her thoughts and dreams. Those symbols on her arms now presented an incessant reminder of the tether bonding her to the mirror. At any rate, even below piles of fabric, that glow was faintly detectable. The knowledge she had gathered from Father Dominic haunted her. There was no clear way to escape the mirror's grasp without sacrifice. The manor stood silent in the night, its windows like empty, watchful eyes. As Eliza stepped through the creaking door, The oppressive atmosphere enveloped her once again. The whispers began immediately, soft, insistent, and growing louder with every step she took toward the parlor. Eliza placed the ritual supplies in the center of the parlor, a circle of iron dust, lines of coarse salt, and protective symbols carved into the floor. Each line was measured carefully, every corner checked against the instructions in Father Dominic's manuscript. Her hands trembled as she worked. The feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. The mirror stretched like an omen, its silvery surface shining unnaturally bright in the dim candle glow. Eliza felt the attraction to it, as if no force had ever been able to hold her away, a grasp by invisible hands. She pressed back on the feeling and began mumbling the incantations in her mouth, preparing the sacred barrier. But as she drew the final line, the candles flickered violently. A cold wind swept through the room, and the flames died. In darkness, the whispers rose into a deafening chorus. "Eliza." The voices all called in unison, "You cannot stop us." The room appeared to twist and stretch as the mirror's surface began to ripple. Shadows spilled from its edges, pooling on the floor and creeping toward her. Eliza scrambled to relight the candles, her heart pounding in her chest. When the flames leapt to life, the shadows retreated, but not before taking shape. They coalesced into figures, faceless and shifting, their presence filling the room. One stepped forward, its head tilting unnaturally as it regarded her. "Eliza," it rasped, its voice like dry leaves scraping across stone. "You belong to us now." The mirror's surface shimmered, and once again Eliza was drawn into a vision. This time she found herself standing in a grand ballroom, its once opulent decor faded and decayed. Ghostly figures danced to a silent melody, their movements jerky and mechanical. At the center of the room stood Evelyn Darkmoor, her hands raised as she commanded the scene. Eliza watched in horror as the dancers turned to her, their faces melting into grotesque masks of anguish. They began to chant in unison, their words unintelligible but filled with pain. Evelyn turned to Eliza, her eyes glowing with malice. "You are no different from me," Evelyn said, her voice reverberating through the room. "You seek answers, but the mirror offers only hunger." As the vision receded, Eliza gasped and was back in the parlor. The ritual circle was whole, but symbols branded her arms as if scorched with a hot iron. Days passed, and the mirror began to bleed its power into reality. She would catch herself with her reflection lingering in the glass behind her, going out of step with her own actions. At times, it would smile or frown when she was expressionless. Objects in her room shifted positions when she wasn't looking. Once, she awoke to find her journal open to a page she hadn't written, filled with cryptic phrases in the same glowing script as the symbols on her arms. Her dreams became more vivid, dragging her deeper into the mirror's world each night. In one dream, she found herself wandering a labyrinth of mirrors, each reflecting twisted versions of herself. The air was thick with the sound of her own voice, mocking and taunting her at every turn. "You will never escape," her reflections whispered. "You are already ours." Eliza's resolve now began to crumble. She sat for hours looking into the mirror, unable to tear herself away from the feelings of dread that were increasing. The faces trapped within continued to grow clearer, their tortures carved into her mind. Abigail appeared often, her hollowed eyes pleading for release. "Eliza," she would whisper, "break the cycle. Do not let it take you." But how does she fight something that's already inside her? Symbols on her arms had spread so that now they were forming elaborate patterns reaching up to the shoulders. She could feel this mirror's hunger gnawing at her soul, its pull growing with each passing moment. One evening, as Eliza sat before the mirror, her reflection spoke to her directly. It was not an echo of her own voice, but something darker, deeper. "I can end this," it said, its lips curling into a sinister smile. "Give yourself to me, and I will release the others. One life for many. Isn't that a fair trade?" Eliza recoiled, her heart racing. The thought of sacrificing herself was terrifying, but could she live with herself if she left the others to their fate? The next night, the shadows returned, stronger and more aggressive. They clawed at the edges of the ritual circle, their forms growing more defined. Eliza fought to maintain the barrier, chanting the incantations she had memorized from the manuscript. But the mirror's power was too much. The shadows broke through, swarming her like a living tide. Just as they reached her, a blinding light filled the room. Eliza felt herself being pulled away, her consciousness slipping into darkness. This was all air inside Blackwood Manor now, thick with unseeable fear pressing hard at Eliza's chest to bear it. She felt that dread in every breath taken in her life, in every hesitant step she took. Her senses were driven crazy because the mirror had reached that stage where its pull turned to be incessant. It pierced through her inner being somehow. There was no questioning what was to be. This Evelyn, through centuries ago, had firmly struck at root that had fed upon her long-lasting terrors. Nights with Eliza were torment. The dreams did not feel like dreams, but horrific glimpses into the world of the mirror, a place where time seemed to warp and terror was hidden in every shadow. She saw herself behind the glass, pounding at it, her screams unheard. But worse, she saw Abigail, once a lovely face contorted into a mask of despair, silently begging Eliza to rescue her. A day passed since her last encounter with the shadows, and Eliza started to feel a change in her home. The walls would whisper to her when no one was around, low and indistinct murmurs that stopped the moment she focused on them. Objects in the house shifted positions without explanation. A book she'd placed on her nightstand would appear on the dining table, open to a random page filled with scrawled words she couldn't understand. The symbols on her arms had grown, spreading down to her wrists and neck, pulsating faintly like a second heartbeat. Her reflection in every surface grew less trustworthy. It moved when she didn't, staring back with malicious intent. Sometimes it would whisper her name in a voice just barely audible, sending chills racing down her spine. Desperate for answers, Eliza returned to Father Dominic, her only ally as chaos began to grow. His usually calm demeanor turned grave at the sight of the marks on her skin. "These symbols," he muttered, tracing the patterns with a trembling hand, "are binding you to it. The mirror is consuming you, Eliza. You're becoming its host." "Host?" Eliza's voice cracked. "What does that mean? What will happen to me?" Father Dominic sighed heavily. The mirror was made with an ancient curse, one that requires a living soul to feed its power. Evelyn's was the first, but it wants more. It has chosen you. Eliza shook her head, panic rising in her chest. "There has to be a way to stop it. I won't let it take me." The priest hesitated, then he handed her a faded journal. "This belonged to Evelyn. She might have something helpful in here, but bear in mind, breaking a curse comes at a grand cost." That night, Eliza spent hours poring over Evelyn's journal. The entries were disjointed, filled with erratic handwriting and frantic descriptions of her descent into madness. Evelyn had tried to resist the mirror, just as Eliza was, but the price she'd paid was steep. "I see them," one entry read. "Their faces pressed against the glass, screaming for release. They claw at the edges of my mind, their whispers constant and maddening. I cannot escape. The mirror hungers, and I am its feast." Another set a ritual to sever the bond between the mirror and its chosen host. It demanded a sacrifice, a life willingly given to trap the mirror's essence once more. The final line chilled Eliza to her core. "If you fail, you will become one of them, trapped for eternity, feeding its insatiable hunger." On the next evening, Eliza tried the severance ritual. She removed all furniture from the parlor and left only a circle of black salt around the mirror. Protective runes were etched into the walls, and candles stood at each cardinal point, their flames flickering uneasily in the still air. She started chanting the incantations from Eveline's journal, her voice shaking. The words filled the room as the mirror's surface started to shimmer, rippling like water. Shadows seeped from its edges, crawling toward her. "You cannot defy us," the voices hissed, layered and overlapping. "We are eternal. You are nothing." The shadows lunged, but the salt barrier held. Eliza pressed on, her voice growing louder as she recited the ancient verses. The mirror's surface cracked, a sharp, piercing sound that reverberated through the room. But as the crack spread, the voices grew louder, more desperate. The shadows writhed, their forms becoming more distinct. One stepped forward, its face morphing into Abigail's. "Eliza," it pleaded, "stop. Please, you don't understand what you're doing." Eliza froze, her heart pounding. "Abigail, is it really you?" "Yes," the figure whispered, its voice trembling. "If you break the mirror, we'll all be lost forever. You'll condemn us to oblivion. Please, find another way." Tears ran down Eliza's face as doubt washed over her. The glass pulsed with energy. The air around it darkened with evil. Maybe breaking it wouldn't free those trapped inside, but kill them. Eliza didn't have the chance to decide. The glass surged its power and broke the barrier of salt. Shadows went for her, pulling on her towards the glass. She screamed, fighting against the hold, but their force was too much. Just as she was going to be pulled in, Father Dominic burst into the room, crucifix at hand. "Leave her!" he commanded, his voice ringing with authority. The shadows recoiled, hissing as the light of the crucifix filled the room. Eliza collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The surface of the mirror had gone still, but she knew it was only a matter of time before it regained its strength. "We don't have much time," Father Dominic said, helping her to her feet. "You need to decide, destroy the mirror, or find another way to break the curse. But you must act quickly. The mirror won't wait." The house groaned as if alive, its ancient bones trembling under the weight of the malevolent force that had now fully awakened. The mirror loomed in the parlor like a cursed monument, its surface no longer smooth or reflective, but churning with shadowy figures clawing at the edges. Every flicker of candlelight seemed to summon another whisper, a faint scream, or a shadow too fleeting to track. Eliza stood in the middle of the room, her breathing ragged, the symbols on her arms now glowing faintly, burning her skin like molten iron. Father Dominic was beside her, gripping his crucifix tightly, his usually steady hands trembling. The journal rested on a table, open to Evelyn's final entry, but Eliza couldn't bring herself to read it again. She already knew what it demanded. The voices from the mirror were no longer whispers, they were screams. A cacophony of anguish and rage erupted from the glass, shaking the room. The shadows began to emerge more freely now, as though the veil between their world and Eliza's had thinned to a breaking point. "You cannot escape us!" the voices roared in unison. "You are ours! Every soul is ours!" Eliza clenched her fists. "Not if I destroy you first." Father Dominic turned to her, his face pale. "Eliza, destroying the mirror might not free the trapped souls. It could condemn them. And you..." Eliza met his gaze, her voice firm. "What choice do I have? If I do nothing, it will consume me, and the cycle will begin again. I won't let that happen." As the surface of the mirror rippled and cracked, a single figure emerged, a ghostly version of Evelyn. Her once beautiful face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, but filled with something akin to sorrow. "You think you can end this?" Evelyn's voice was a mixture of pity and contempt. "You don't understand what you're facing." "Then help me," Eliza shouted. "Tell me how to stop it." Evelyn's ethereal form hesitated, her ghostly hands extending toward Eliza, but reaching only that far. The mirror is not only a cursed object, it lives. It feeds on despair, on fear. Destroying it will only let its hunger spread to the world. The only way to keep it trapped is to give it what it desires willingly. A soul, Father Dominic whispered darkly. Yes, Evelyn whispered. A sacrifice of desire. But warn, once the mirror receives its vessel, it shall lie idle for another century. It will not die, but it will slumber. Eliza felt Evelyn's words crush down on her. Was she able to give up herself in exchange for trapping the evil within? Or was she to use another method of doing this to put countless other lives at peril? The room seemed to close in around them as Eliza made her decision. She stepped forward, her voice steady, though terror coursed through every vein. Tell me what I have to do. Evelyn's form was dissolving, her voice echoing through the air as she disappeared into nothingness. Enter the mirror. Offer yourself willingly. But beware, Eliza. Once you enter, there is no return. Father Dominic caught her by the arm. You can't do this. There has to be another way. Eliza spun toward him, tears running down her face. If there is, we don't have time to find it. The mirror is growing stronger by the minute. If I don't stop it now, it will consume everything. Reluctantly, Father Dominic stepped back, his hand tightening on the crucifix. May God be with you, child. Eliza walked up to the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her with an expression she didn't recognize. Calm, resolute, and strangely welcoming. The closer she got, the more the symbols on her arms burned, their glow intensifying until it filled the room. As she reached out to touch the glass, it rippled like water. The voices stilled for a moment, as if the mirror itself was holding its breath. Then, with one final glance at Father Dominic, Eliza stepped through. Inside the mirror, the world was not at all what she had expected. It was vast and endless, with shadows shifting and faint echoes of laughter, crying, and screams. The air was thick and suffocating, and the ground beneath her feet was as cold as ice. She saw them, the souls entrapped within the mirror, their faces contorted in pain, their hands stretched out to her as if pleading for deliverance. Among them was Abigail, whose once beautiful face had now been distorted and ashen. At the heart of the void stood a great pulsating mass of darkness, the core of the mirror. It exuded pure malice, its form shifting incessantly between shadow and light. Eliza walked toward it, her pace slow but resolute. The core spoke, its voice a cacophony of all the screams and whispers she'd heard. You offer yourself freely? Eliza nodded, weeping. Yes, but I want something in return. The core paused, as if mulling over her words. Speak your desire. Free the others, she said firmly. Every soul you've taken, let them go. If you take me, you take only me. The core pulsed wildly, its shape writhing as it shrieked in rage. Then it stilled, its voice cold and calculating. Very well, the others will be freed, but you will belong to me forever. As Eliza draws closer to the core, the symbols on her arms spread out, covering the whole of her body with a blinding light. She screams as the light collides with the core, and its darkness engulfs her body. In the parlor, the mirror shattered violently. Shards flew in all directions. Father Dominic shielded himself as the glass broke totally, leaving behind an empty frame. The shadows disappeared, and the air was silent. The trapped souls were free, their ghostly forms rising toward the heavens before fading away. But Eliza was gone. Months passed, and the Blackwood Manor stood silent. The mirror's frame remained in the parlor, an empty relic of the horrors it once contained. Father Dominic often visited, lighting candles in Eliza's memory and praying for her soul. One evening, he stood in the parlor, feeling a chill. He turned towards the frame and saw it, not the mirror itself, but a faint reflection. Eliza's face stared back at him, her expression calm but somber. She was still there, trapped within the mirror's realm, watching over the world she had saved.